Welcome back to our First Peter series. I'm Alan Middleton. This is Ryan Smith, and we're picking back up in First Peter chapter 2. And before we jump in there, a few reminders that have been brought up along the way. Peter is a leader of the church in Rome. Was prompted to write this letter due to the persecution that was taking place in other provinces of Rome. And so he writes this letter to encourage these Christians facing persecution to stay true to their faith. He's drawing upon their story, their collective story, specifically drawing upon this language and imagery of exile to help encourage and empower them in their living. And last but certainly not least, context matters. Context matters greatly. And we're dealing with some verses that I know personally I've heard pulled and plucked clean out of context to justify one's positions or thoughts. And so dangerous at worst, at best it's lazy and faulty. But context matters, so let's keep that in mind as we work through this part in 1 Peter 2. In watching this video and reading through the chapter, there's three words that really stuck out to me: submission, freedom, and suffering. And in verses 13 through 15, Peter writes, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people." Again, this is one of those passages that we like to seem to pluck out of context and just throw it out there. See, this tells us submit to government. You don't push back, and really, Paul is not advocating at all. And I think Kyle did a pretty good job of addressing this. He's not advocating for this mindless, robotic, thoughtless submission, giving over your life to a government. Because this is Peter who, with the other apostles, before the Sanhedrin, uttered the words, "We must obey God, not human beings."
The same Peter who brought a sword to a prayer meeting, and as Jesus is being arrested, tries to take off a guy's head.
Yeah.
I really appreciated how Eidelman, in his portion of it, had that separation of we're Christians. He didn't say it, but what I heard was what Jesus said of being in this world but not of it. We're Christians living in this world. How do we exist as people that are faithful in a world that's not faithful?
Yeah, and when we look at this verse in its context, his command to submit to government, it's less about government and more about submission to Christ. If you look at the verses that follow, in verses 16 and 17, he continues, "Live as free people. Do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor." We are to fear God. That's where it begins. Is this fear of God? We're to live as God's slaves, not some governments, not some emperors. We're to live as God's slaves. And so what we see Peter is advocating is living lives that reflect Christ, so that those who try to slander, those who may try to stir up problems, that puts an end to that foolish talk. And B, hopefully through our living this life of Christ, they see Christ and eventually come to know Him. And we see that even before he talks about submitting to your government authorities by saying, "Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that He visits." So again, yes, God grants power. He grants authority to governments. We see that. It's not this mindless submission.
Yeah, and ultimately submission to God, and even acknowledging and living in submission to the authority of God.
Yes.
And I love it the way that the Apostle Peter is addressing he's addressing a particular people living in a particular time. And I appreciate you're saying we've got to look at the totality of what's being described here, understanding it in its original context, and then seeking to apply those principles to who we are and how we live today. Ultimately, this idea of authority and living in the world and not of the world, and our following the example of Jesus is founded in laying down our power. You know, we're so intent on I have my rights, and I want to make sure that I utilize my rights, and don't infringe upon me, don't tread on me, and yet we look to Scripture. And time and again, we're like, man, this goes against my human nature. Yes, Jason, yes, it does. When the example of Christ is a laying down of power so that the authority of God, that the glory of God can be revealed.
Well, and that's part of the reason why freedom stuck out to me. This was an interesting thing for Peter to be talking about, especially to this group of people. Again, verse 16, live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. This talk of freedom really stands out because of who he's talking to. He's talking to people who are being persecuted for their faith. He's talking to slaves who are subject to unfair and harsh owners. Yeah. And he'll even go on to in chapter 3 to talk to wives, and we know that women in that day especially were often taken advantage of, and a life of freedom is not what you would imagine. Yeah. And it's a call to live life. This call to live life as a free people. It's a bold move here, really, because physically what they're enduring, what they're experiencing, is not freedom. Yeah. But he reminds them, you are free. So live as free people, because this world can't take that freedom from you.
But in how often have these verses, and then fast forward to some of what you mentioned out of chapter 3, how often have these verses been, again, just pulled out of context and utilized to affirm ungodly behavior or an ungodly way of life? You know, Peter in no way is advocating abuse. He's in no way advocating slavery.
Yeah.
He's in no way advocating women being mistreated. And yet, because of the society and the norms of the day, the Apostle Peter is addressing Christians who live within a certain and a particular social construct, calling them for an obedience to Christ in such a way that others, and you brought it up, others might look to them, and it would be undeniable that they're followers of Jesus.
Yeah. Again, it's not a Sir William Wallace-like call to fight for your freedom. Yeah. It's not take back what
even though that was a just cause.
But. Yeah, but it's remember, you are free. Live this life as free people.
Good.
Again, that freedom that Christ has given us can't be taken away by any worldly authority. And it reminds me of that scene with Jesus and Pilate, where Pilate's reminding Jesus he has the power to either set him free or to crucify him. And Jesus' words there are, it's important that we listen in closely, because what he says is, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. A couple of things there. A, he's acknowledging, yes, you do in fact have some sort of power over me, but I know where that power comes from. In fact, it comes from him. And so this authority, it's not this call to fight and take back our freedom. We are free. Our freedom, true freedom, freedom of sin and death, it allows us to live as free people regardless of our plight.
Good.
And then you go on to verses 19 and 21. And he says, for it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow His steps. And this passage and others like it, this is one that's never easy for me to take in because it just sounds so backwards to me. It's something I want to push back on because suffering is it's unpleasant, and so it's undeniable that we are going to suffer. That's a part of this life, and we've also been given an example, a way to suffer. Don't retaliate. We see, and Peter's making mention of all these. Don't retaliate when they hurl insults. Don't make threats when they persecute you, and entrust yourself to God. And this is that glorious suffering, suffering that leads others to Christ being glorified. That's sounds so odd to say that the suffering is glorious, but that's what Peter's talking about here.
And that's what the gospel ultimately is about.
Yeah.
And to continue to track through the life of the Apostle Peter, he's pointing us back to Jesus and the example of Christ. The Apostle Peter, of course, who is a part of Jesus' ministry, who endures all of those things along with Jesus, even though he's a deserter of Jesus, as the others are, after Jesus is arrested. And then to track Peter's life as he's restored to faith, as he has denied Christ 3 times, and then he's restored by Christ, back to Him. But then there's extra biblical material that instructs us that the Apostle Peter will also be crucified, he'll lose his life. And so here he is, years and years before, talking about submission, talking about seeing a bigger picture, laying down our power. And church tradition tells us that he lived out all of this.
Yeah. Hopefully you've watched the video of Kyle Alderman, and after watching this, we hope that you'll continue on and click next and go on and answer those questions. That gives us some good feedback, and hopefully will help you kind of process not only what Kyle had to say, but what Peter says in chapter 2.